All right, so what are we talking about? Going to give you kind of overview of A/B testing, kind of what it is, right? We'll breeze through that really quickly. Then kind of move to what's A/B testing as a product manager. And then finally, I'm going to run through a handful of kind of best practices and tips about when you're running an A/B test, things to look out for. Alrighty. So why do we A/B test, right? When you're building a new feature, you want to do it iteratively. You want to kind of figure out what works, right? And you do it in kind of small little steps, just so that if you kind of make that mistake over here, you're like, oops, and you can roll it back and kind of go somewhere else and finally make it to the end goal, right? At least that's the general principle around A/B testing. So how it works, right? You take a bucket of users, split them in half, give them one experience to this bucket of users, give another experience to that bucket of users, and you find out what wins, right? And that's the general principle of how an A/B test works. Anyone confused, right? Kind of very basic, very high level. Good? All right, move on. All right, so when you run an A/B test, here's kind of the way that you want to think about it, right? So you want to think about, well, what am I trying to solve, right? And this seems very kind of academic. Like, why am I thinking of it this way? And for people that are in organizations that are like, hey, let's just build, and you don't really kind of think about the bigger picture, this framework really kind of helps you think about, okay, well, what is the bigger picture that I'm trying to do, right? So you want to figure out, what am I trying to solve, and what is this thing that I am trying to test, right? That's the hypothesis. What is it going to do? Then you move over to the variant. You want to figure out, well, what's the variable I'm changing? It's blue button, red button, right? Pop-up, layover, whatever it is. You want to figure out the objective. So this is, what am I measuring, right? You have to be able to measure lift or change or something, right? So if you can't measure it, right, you have to basically figure out what that objective is or what the multiple objectives are. And then finally, you got to figure out, well, how you're going to serve it, right? How are you going to target it? Are you targeting all your users? Are you targeting just desktop users? Are you targeting people that hit your site at night or a certain time, right? So these are all the things that kind of like you just generally have to think about when you're saying, okay, I'm going to run a test. All right, so now that you have kind of the framework of thinking about individual tests, let's kind of walk through that life cycle. So you'll have a coffee with somebody and you're like, oh, I have this great idea. You can put it on a napkin, right? And so that's the idea part, right? And nothing much, right? You're just kind of saying, I want to put down this idea and capture it somewhere. It could be a spreadsheet, whatever. The next phase is, you're doing some due diligence. You're doing the research to figure out, is it possible, right? Like, can I really make this happen? Is it feasible, right? That's basically what you're trying to figure out. And also, what am I measuring? Like, what is that metric? What's that objective that I'm measuring for? Once you kind of figure that out, and that's kind of basically your requirements gathering phase, right? Like, then you go into in development. And this is, when you start kind of building it and kind of pulling all the pieces together, assuming you're building it, right? Because of your product managers, you're probably not like your engineers, right? And for the people that are building it themselves, highly recommend code review, right? Get your engineers, pull them aside and say, hey, can you please look at my code, right? There's no shame in that. It makes you a better developer. And it also builds trust with your engineering team. We can talk about that later. And then once it's code reviewed, past that puppy, then number 5, you execute and you launch it, right? And then you let the test run. Don't touch it. Just let it go. It will run once it's hit conclusion and it's reached statistical significance. You say, hey, I have a winner, or I don't have a winner. But you have some kind of conclusion, right? And then what you want to do is really document those learnings. And that's basically, what do we do? And then what do I do next after this? And after that, then you just kind of do it again, right? Questions? No? Good? Okay. So this is, A/B testing is slightly different depending on which company you're at. Yes?
When you said document, you want to document those findings, what is that?
Could be, so the question is, how do you document your findings? It can be as simple as just throwing the results of the test in a Word doc or Google slide, right? Just document it, like hold it for posterity, right? So you can say, okay, we ran this test. What was the learnings? What was the findings, right? It gave me 300% lift. Great, document it, right? So then you can always look back and say, look, 3 months ago we ran this test, right? And that's all it is. Nothing too fancy. Yes.
So just think, you're talking about testing features on a live site.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And you said when it reaches statistical significance, that gives you something. So what is the number? I mean, what numbers are we looking at?
I'm going to hold that question, and then because some of the tips will kind of actually address that part. The answer is it depends. But so testing at different companies is different, right? Like, and this is really around testing culture. So dependent if you're working at a huge company versus, let's say if you're working at Spotify versus a media company, it's extremely different, right? Like if you are at a company that builds everything themselves, they probably have a huge testing culture versus if you're at a startup where everyone's saying, oh yeah, we're data driven, but they're doing really everything by gut, right? The way that you run a test is very different in both of those environments. So that's kind of like the variable that you can't really control for, but be cognizant when you go into these environments, right? Not everyone does A/B testing the same way. Ecosystem, so this is dependent on what type of company you're at. So again, Spotify, Yammer, or these huge, like Slack, right? What they've probably done is they've built A/B testing into their stack. So when you're launching a test, it's something that it's kind of innate to when they launch a product. Versus if you're, let's say you don't have a huge engineering team, or like it's just a simple website. What you do is you can add Optimizely or Dynamic Yield or Adobe Target, like any of these other kind of A/B testing platforms, and bolt it onto the site, and that'll basically work too, right? But depending on how that ecosystem is set up, how you run that test is going to be slightly differently. Yes.
Is there like a minimum number of users doing a test or an average, or does it depend on the?
Depends. We'll get to that. And then the final part is resourcing. The resourcing part is, it depends on how many front-end engineers or back-end engineers or just engineers in general that you have access to that can be dedicated to your test. There's some organizations that have kind of a great testing culture, and every single time you want to launch a new feature, the first question is, well, did we test it? Did we have lift before we launch it? Versus there's other places they think of testing as kind of like that stepchild over on the side, and they're just like, oh yeah, we'll run a test, right? So when you're in an organization where they kind of think of A/B testing as an afterthought, then you frequently are sending that, well, I need an engineer to help me build this test, or I need help executing XYZ, right? And so just be cognizant that the resourcing part of this is a component that we don't really always have our control over. Okay, I'm gonna go into like a whole bunch of kind of like just general best practices. They're not in any order. Really, basically, the last 2 weeks I thought of, okay, well, what are the things I talk about at work a lot, and then basically threw them up here. So this is basically in the last 2 weeks, the stuff advice that we've been talking around A/B tests, right? So first things first is all users are not created the same. And what I mean by this is when you run a test, right? Let's say you had 1 million users, and and you ran your test, and of that 1 million users, you were like, okay, well, this variant gave me a 20% lift. You don't know what that 1 million users were comprised of, right? They could be of your mobile users, they could be your brand loyalists, they could be from social or search, or like there's a lot of kind of detail in your audience. And it is important for you to understand how your individual audiences are interacting with your site, because you can make a pretty big gross assumption saying, oh, well, this site gave me lift, or this variant gave me lift. And so therefore, it's going to work for everybody. And that's actually not true. So just be cognizant that just because you ran it against a whole bunch of people doesn't mean that everybody in that group was the same.
I have a question if I may.
Yeah.
For example, do you mean that, like, say, the variant, which is giving you the lift, it's gaining that from techies who don't know or is savvy to the technology, but to all the other bunch of other users you have, or more lay people, it didn't have an effect on them. So you need to know which segment it had the effect on them.
So it could be in that. So here's an example of this. Let's say I had a website and my traffic was 60% mobile and 40% desktop, right? So let's say it was that kind of 60% mobile. So I run a variant, and So I run my test, and the outcome of the test is I had a 10% lift, right? Could very well be it resonated. It didn't resonate at all with your mobile users, the 60% of your users, but it really resonated really well with your desktop users, right? Because let's face it, when you design, most of the time you're designing for a desktop, right? At least on the website. So it's just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind that even though a test got lift, right, you want to kind of dig into the numbers a little bit and like understand, well, who was really engaging with that variant, right? Good, all right. The next is it's a volume game, and this kind of speaks to your question about, well, how many people do you need, right? And if you have a feature that doesn't have a lot of people interacting with it, there's no reason to A/B test it, right? Like the general concept is, right, you're just throwing so much traffic against it that it's almost, we're confident that this is the one providing us lift, right? But if you don't have enough traffic, then you're just kind of like, well, I had 9 people here and I had 2 people here, right? It's like, right? Like at Vice, we're dealing with millions of people, and we're like, okay, well, 2 million came that way and 2 million came that way, and still we'll like run it for like 2 weeks and we'll be like, maybe that wasn't enough, right? So we're talking high volume. So this basically means if you're a startup and you're like in stealth mode and you're like, hey, you know what? I got like a good 10,000 people hitting my site. Maybe not the best, right? Like it's good insight, potentially, right? It's something that like, it's a good gut check, but to really get the true statistical significance, hey, this is generating lift, you're probably not gonna get it. Yeah?
What do you think a good p-value is for EM institutions? It's obviously company independent, but curious how you guys think about it. Right?
So the question is, how do we think about p-value? The way we think about p-value is it's the default value that comes with Google Optimize. Like we could change it, but our general philosophy is we want to iterate quickly on it. So we want to get the statistical significance, get the learnings, and then rerun, right? So our general take is get to statistical significance quickly, learn, and then reiterate, right, off of the same feature.
Yeah, so your definition of statistical significance being like a p-value like less than 5% and like whatever.
Yeah, we didn't tweak it off of the default value. Yeah, I mean, I know there's some people that are very kind of like, well, you could kind of ramp it up or ramp it down, and if it's gonna work, it's gonna work, right? The way that that's our kind of general kind of take against it. Yeah.
How did you get that heat map? Is it just clicks or?
The heat map is off of a Google search where I said, hey, heat map website, and that's right. Like, but just generally speaking, it's like if you're testing something down here that no one interacts with, yeah, there's no reason to A/B test that, right? Like it's just not. You're gonna run it for like a month and 2 months, and then like not get anything from it. Yeah, so a lot of the images I just like say, well, I need something to talk about. Let it run. So you're gonna run a test, right? And it's gonna do really well in the first 3 days. And you're like, great, I have a lot of people interacting with this. We're gonna run with this. I would say check for seasonality, right? Like, especially for media companies, right? There's a lot of like, well, people interact with your site differently on the weekends versus during the weekday, or like in the evening versus in the morning, right? So like all of these seasonal things, or if you're working at an e-commerce company, right? Like what happens during Black Friday is not, kind of typical, right? So just keep that in mind. So I would say when you're running a test, rule of thumb, 2 weeks, right? But like if you don't, run it a little bit longer. But just make sure you let it run. Just because, I've seen tests where we've launched it in the first 3 days, you're really excited because you launched a great test, and then you look at it and you're like, oh, variant A was, really kind of killing it, and then you let it run for the full 2 weeks and it flips, right? So just be cognizant of that. Tip 4. Okay, so this is track many objectives. So when you're working with tools like Adobe Target, Optimizely, Google Optimize, they always have this field where, well, what's the metric that you want to measure, right? And so a lot of times, actually, you know what? Let's do it this way. Let's say you're a website and you wanted to drive newsletter signups, right? And this is the look and feel that your designers came out with. All right, someone's gonna hit the site, right? And we're gonna give them this huge sign up, and we're gonna drive signups, right? So what are the objectives that we would want to measure? Anybody?
how many people signed up compared to who closed it?
Okay, so signups, you want to know closes.
How
What?
many people opened it?
How many people, so let's say it loads on open, or are you saying by email?
I would have said by email.
Okay, so how many people actually signed up and opened the email?
Yeah.
Great, okay. Anybody else?
Well, what about people that you already have, like what were your track, like what was your sign up rate before?
That could be a benchmark that you could look at, yeah, sure.
Maybe the bounce rate people, I guess.
Great, bounce rate, in the back.
More field interaction, not necessarily sign up, if anyone interacted with that box.
So hover and focused on the box, okay?
How many people leave the site once they see it?
Right, bounce rate. So you want to, when you launch a test, and all great answers, right? When you launch a test, you don't want to just say, I'm looking at one metric and one metric only, right? Because what happens is you could get a whole bunch of people signing up for this, but they never open the email. Or you get a whole bunch of people that sign up for this and you realize 80% of your users are bouncing the site because they find that annoying, right? So as much as possible, think of like all the different ways that this test could impact whatever metrics and track all of them, right? And depending on the platform, sometimes you actually have to set it up prior. So sometimes there's some platforms where you'll launch the test, you'll put two variables on there, or two metrics on there, and you're like, okay, I'm looking at these two variables. Then you'll let it run, and you realize, oh, I wanted to see how this third variable or metric interacted, and you can't go back and get it, right? So when you're picking your systems, just be cognizant of that. You have to kind of set it all up front. Questions? Did I lose anybody? Good? All right. Avoid overlapping tests. So this is things like, let's say you're doing an email sign up, right? And you're doing an actually email sign up is probably not a good one. But let's say you're doing something like trying to drive pages per session, right? So you have, some tests over here driving recirculation. You got some other tests, driving more recirculation. And at the end of the day, your test is going to say, okay, this drove lift. But you wouldn't be able to figure out, well, was it test A or test B, right? So if you're in a scenario where you have two different tests that you really want to run, stagger them, right? Run one first, let that one end, and then trigger the next one, right? So that at least the results are clean. Okay, so this is this is actually a conversation I had recently where we ran a test and we launched it at 50-50, right? So 50% of the people saw the control, 50% of the people saw the variant, right? And we let it run. And someone came back and said, well, people at Yahoo were, they'll do like 5% here and 5% there, and the rest is control, right? We're not Yahoo, right? Unless you work for Yahoo, and so be it, or Google, or whatever, right? If you had that much traffic that you could really just only show 5% of your users, great. For the rest of us peons, you really need all the traffic you can get. So if I had a choice of sending more users, 50-50 split, get the learnings, and then do it again, absolutely, I would take that route versus having a 5 or 10% audience group and then letting it run for like 3 months without any statistical significance.
Great question.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying. It's about generating enough numbers, enough people to do the test.
Yeah.
You need to get, so like on a smaller company, like say, recently launched Startup, you would want to do 50-50, make sure you generate enough numbers for it. But my thinking would be that, maybe this is what they're thinking of the larger company, like say Google or whatever. If you have, the control group is already tried and true. You know it's already working good, you don't want to argue with it or compromise the integrity. That's why you would only divert 10% of the variant to see how they play out. But they have such a large website visitation that you can afford to do that, and it'll still give you the good number. Is that what you're getting at?
Right. So that's say let's say you're not Google, right? And you had a startup, and let's say you have 10,000 users a day, right? And that's a lot, right? And you're hitting the site, and they're interacting with your site. If you create a variant and you only get, let's say, diverted 10% to it, right? It's gonna take a long time for you to figure out whether or not that change was worth it, right? And so it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? Like, is it worth waiting, or is it worth just getting the learnings as soon as you can, just so that you can reiterate, right? It's a trade-off question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay. there's going to be inevitably a test where somebody wanted to test that footer, right? And like no one sees the footer, and that test is running for like a really long time. So like 2 months plus, I would say, is a long time. I would say more than a month is anything over 2 months. I'd say is a long time, right? Don't be afraid to kill it, because the thing is, even if you let it run for 3 months and they say, hey, we have a winner, finally, after 3 months, we've got a winner. That data is so stale, like it's not going to be useful to you. So don't be afraid to kill your tests, right? It's like sometimes you just gotta kill it. This is true for new product managers. So you'll be really excited. You're going to run a test. You're going to set up a test. You tell everybody, hey, we're running a test. And then you set your test, and it's like, my test sucked, right? Like I had negative lift. It didn't work. Like I didn't drive, like that beautiful email sign up that we spent all this money on didn't drive signups. What do we do? Right? And then people are like, well, we'll do it again, or we'll tweak it, or we'll learn, or whatever. No, you got to share that news, right? So especially in people in my role where like my job is basically to be the shepherd for A/B tests, or where you're the product manager for a particular feature, right? A/B tests, the results of an A/B test, or documenting that and kind of holding it out, it's needed because people need to trust your results, right? Your organization needs to trust and embrace A/B testing, especially if you have an A/B testing culture, right? They'll accept the fact that it's a fail. You can't always pick winners, right? Even if you're in an environment that really is new to A/B testing and you're like, well, our first one had to be a win, share the bad news. Because that bad news is insight to say, hey, don't go that route, go this route, right? So don't hide the bad results, because it'll probably bite you in the butt later. Just be very open, be like, hey, we ran a test, this is the results, this is what we learned from it, this is our next steps based on these learnings, right? And just kind of roll with the punches, be very transparent about it. Don't try to kind of sweep it under the rug. MPTs. MPT stands for multivariate testing. So if you have a lot of users, right? So if you're a Google, Spotify maybe, right? Like where you have a whole bunch of users, MPT is fine, right? You can run with this. If you're Vice size and down, I would say avoid it, right? We don't do it, right? And our general thought is, so let me just kind of run through the basics of what a multivariate test is. So a multivariate test is where you're testing multiple variables at the same time. So take that newsletter sign up, right? And so let's say we're going to do the newsletter sign up. We're going to change the copy, right? So let's say we have copy changes. That's one set of variables, right? And let's say we're going to change the placement as well, right? So instead of a pop-up, we're going to do it as like an in-body sign up, and that's the second variable, right? That is basically two different variables that you're tweaking against. So like, you'll have different experiences, and you basically have to run it against a whole bunch of people before you get any kind of learnings from it. Because you don't have a lot, I'm assuming because you don't have a lot of users, you're gonna run into a scenario where your MPT is gonna take forever to run. Your MPT is gonna run 2 months plus, right? And then again, you're gonna run into, well, the learnings weren't that kind of valuable to you, right? So as much as possible, my rule of thumb is stick with AB. You could do ABN, right? You could do like 3 different types of copy. That's fine, right? Because it's all kind of different. It's the same variable you're tweaking. That's fine. But if you start kind of doing different variables across different, like when it starts looking like a matrix, I would say think about paring it down and running it as sequential A/B tests. All right, this is my last one. There's some companies that think that A/B testing is everything, right? Like, that's A/B test everything, right? Like, and if you're going to launch a new feature, A/B test it. If the feature doesn't exist, you can't A/B test it, right? Like, I know this is kind of there's some people where they will be like, well, let's say, let's take that newsletter sign up. Let's say your website never had a newsletter sign up, and you're like, okay, we're gonna test the newsletter sign up. There's nothing to test against. There's no control to test against, right? So there's no reason to A/B test it, right? It's a concept that a lot of people don't get, and just it's just not a silver bullet. The other thing is this: if you don't have a lot of traffic, or let's say you're a startup in stealth mode or something like that, like you just don't have the traffic, you can't A/B test it, right? Like A/B testing is really, it has to be A lot of people are seeing it. A lot of people are interacting with it for it to be valuable. If not, like you're just wasting your time. That's it. That's all my slides. Questions? Yeah.
I know we've talked about this a little bit. I'm wondering how to actually figure out how much traffic or how many conversions per A/B test.
Yeah.
I know it depends, but
So here's yeah. So the question is, how much traffic do you need, right? So let me run the scenario with you. Okay, let's say I have variant A and my control, right? And let's say I have 1 million users, right? And I split my million users in 2 groups, and the conversion on this side and the conversion on this side. Let's say they convert equally, right? Let's say I had 500,000 push the button 50% of the time here, and I had 500,000 push the button 50% of the time here. It didn't get statistical significance because it was kind of like a seesaw, right? So it's really dependent on what you're putting out there, right? Like if it's like red button, blue button, right? Like, and it really didn't make a difference. If it's running forever, that just means there is no difference, right? That's why there's no kind of firm numbers. Like throw 1 million users. Well, if the million users split equally, then like you wouldn't get to statistical significance. That's why it's a it depends answer.
I guess I'm asking, how do you calculate statistical?
So yeah, I don't. I let the platforms do it, right? The way that Vice has done it is that because we've basically purchased another platform to do our A/B testing for us, right? We basically set up our metrics, we run the test, and then we'll basically see the results, and it'll spit out the results for us. Now, if you wanted to kind of dig into the numbers and like, you know, look at every single interaction and then run it, yeah, there's data scientist people that could do it. Not me, sorry. I don't have the experience doing that. Any other questions? Yep.
You mentioned that there's certain environments that like lend themselves to A/B testing, culture of A/B testing. Do you have any recommendations on introducing that culture?
I would say that so when I was, I'll tell you a story. I don't, because it's the only time that I've ever had to like truly introduce it in an environment. So when we were at Timeout, we were doing a site launch, and we weren't doing A/B testing then, right? So we had a hotshot designer come in, and they basically said, "Hey, this is what the new Timeout site's going to look like, ta-da!" Right? And like beautiful mocks, and we had no idea if it was going to work. It was just like, "Hey, here's the new beautiful site, and we're going to build it this way," and everyone's opinion was different, right? We had people that were on the analytics. I was like, oh, people are not gonna like that. We had our editors like, oh, no one's gonna like that. The colors suck here, the spacing sucks there, right? Like, and you had all these opinions coming in, and you had, like the designers were basically sitting there saying, okay, I'll take your feedback and I'll rejigger it and then come back, right? And when you get into those kind of cycles where like there's opinions and like there's no kind of like data behind it, that's a really good time to kind of introduce it. Be like, hey, that's A/B tested. It's really hard to do when like you're doing kind of wholesale changes, like especially if like you're building a new product or something like that, and you're like, hey, well, can we A/B test this entirely new app? No, just build the app, right? Do a phase 1 and then test each module within it, right? A/B testing wasn't really kind of designed for that kind of wholesale kind of launch, right? It's really kind of think of it from a feature by feature perspective, right? Like here's a button, or here's a recirculation module or something, right? Here's an independent feature.
A follow-up question, do you recommend any specific platform to do that over others? Like, is there like an inexpensive version that can convince people to use that?
Yeah, so I've worked closely with Google Optimize and Adobe Target. I've seen the Optimize Lead platform and the Dynamic Yield platform. And I would say that for low budget, you want to get something off the ground really quickly, Google's platform is actually pretty good in the sense that it's free when you kind of kick it up, right? And it integrates with Google Analytics, and you know you can pretty much get a test up and running relatively kind of painlessly. I would say that most A/B testing platforms have this kind of two-part, right? Whereas like, hey, we launched the test and we set up the test and we analyze the results, right? So Adobe targets like this, where they could be like, hey, we launched the test on this side, but if you want to analyze your results, you got to use Google, Omniture or Adobe Analytics on this side, and both of these platforms cost a bucket load of money, right? So if you're looking at, Optimizely, it's not a cheap solution either, but they've kind of built both systems kind of together all in one holistically. So in scenarios where you're looking at like, oh, well, I ran a test and I had these 3 metrics that I was looking at, I forgot to add the 4th, they can actually give you the ability to retroactively kind of look back at it, which is a cool feature, right? But I would say if you're just kind of kicking off, getting started, don't have a lot of money, I would say check out Google Optimize. Guy in the back, sorry.
So these scenarios, are you serving these A, B in a simultaneous timeline, or is A out for like a month and then B out for a month? How are you selecting who's getting A and B?
That's there's a difference between sequential testing and A/B testing, right? So if let's say I was launching a scenario A for, let's say, the month of July, and then scenario B for the month of August, right? That's sequential testing, and that's not A/B testing, right? A/B testing is at the same period of time, splitting your audience in half and saying, audience A gets this and audience B gets that. I don't select. That's kind of the value of having a platform do it for you, right? Is they kind of make the randomness for you, but also factor in the fact that, oh, we have a lot of people that are mobile users in this test. You know what? I'm going to throw more mobile users on that test, and kind of factoring in all those kind of other variables like, oh, these people came in from Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, making sure that they try their best to kind of give you a holistic kind of equal sampling on both sides. Yeah.
So if I'm using content marketing to drive users back to my website, would you consider A/B testing where I'm taking content, or I'm using content on different social channels, same content? So
so the question is, if you're using content marketing, is A/B testing kind of the right thing for you?
Is it considered A/B testing?
So I would say the best way to use that would be, let's say you had a blog, right? And there was a post that you just put out and you want to drive users with that post. How you market that, let's say Facebook, right? You can have 2 different variants and test how that post shows up for users in their feed, right? That would be A/B testing. You're testing not the actual content, but what is served to those users, right? So yes, then in that scenario, yes, it would be A/B testing.
But to use that same content on Facebook versus Twitter versus LinkedIn, for instance?
You can, or you could just test out different titles or different lead images and see what resonates with the specific audiences.
Well, my purpose is to see which social channel drives the most traffic.
Right. So depending on how the data comes through, right, then you'll be able to see, oh, well, let's take this. Let's take an example of, let's say you're running a post on LinkedIn versus Facebook, right? And it's about cute dogs, let's just say. It's going to do really well on Facebook. It's probably not going to do that well on LinkedIn. You'll see it, right? So the content itself will speak to it, right? Like your core content will get you to like a base level. And then the A/B testing of your title versus your image or whatever or not, that'll give you kind of the incremental on top of that, right? So, but if you're just trying to figure out which channel works better, yeah, you could throw you could technically A/B test that. It wouldn't really be an A/B test in its kind of truest form, but yes, it's worth testing. Sorry, other hands? Yes.
Because you work in media, and I work in media startup as well, but not startup media.
We're starting.
Do you feel that the seasonal aspect of traffic is different when it comes to like a media company than it would be to a software type of company? Like, you always have to think about like Trump's or something crazy, so our traffic's going to be different today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something to kind of be aware of. So Vice, we did that Charlottesville documentary, right? Our traffic spiked, right? Like all-time high, right? So whenever we were running tests in that period of time, we're like cognizant that, oh, well, there were other forces that were probably driving things, right? So we'll just rerun the test. But in terms of seasonality, and it absolutely makes a difference.
So you take out like that, the traffic from that day to keep things?
Sometimes, so it depends on the ecosystem that you're in, right? So if you're in an environment where you have data scientists that can kind of comb through the numbers and crunch the numbers for you, yeah, they could probably just subtract that day, right? And like dig through the numbers. But if you're using kind of like one of these platforms that like you don't have the ability to select and pick and choose, and technically you shouldn't have to, I would say just rerun the same test, right? Just take a different time, remove that seasonality out of it, rerun the test, and then you will have that kind of insight that you need, right? But yes, so for media companies, the week, 2 weeks is usually a good kind of length of time to figure out kind of the ebbs and flows of how people interact with your site.
Are there any other differences that you see between a media company and a software stock company when it comes to A/B testing?
So as a media company, you kind of want to be really cognizant of where your users are coming from, right? Like you're a Facebook user, like if you're on Facebook and you're coming in and you're reading the story, you're just going to bounce out. You're going back to Facebook because that's where you want to be, right? Like the thought that I want to stick on a Vice article, as much as I think they all love Vice, right? Like probably not. So being cognizant that there are some users that just don't want to hang around there versus like, let's say I was at Slack and like I'm in Slack all day and I'm building a new feature and A/B testing it, like it's extremely different, right? Like because it's like they're in that ecosystem that entire time, right? Sorry, I got the 2-minute flag. So sorry, handful of questions. Yes.
Could you talk more about features that don't exist yet and like that A/B testing of that? And you said newsletter versus no newsletter. It's not an A/B test. Can you just elaborate more on the philosophy behind that?
So the question is, if you're trying to run an A/B test around a new feature, like, what do you do, right? So I would say in the purest sense, you can't run an A/B test because the control is blank, right? You don't have something there, right? So if you're launching something new, my recommendation was just launch whatever is new and then test the iterations of that whatever module it is, right? So in the example of, let's say that newsletter sign up, right? Let's say the newsletter didn't exist, right? Like build the newsletter and test like 2 or 3 variants of that same modal, right? And then you can figure out which design worked better. But if you're just saying, hey, modal versus no modal, that's not a test. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just curious, if I were to launch a newsletter,
right,
and I were to say, like, is it worth doing the newsletter in the first place? Is it going to bring up traffic for what's going on versus the control is without it?
Right.
Why would that not count?
So I guess the underlying thing is what you're driving, right? So like, or what you're measuring. So if what you're measuring is newsletter signups, right? If your primary measure is let's see how many people like sign up for that newsletter, you're going to have your variant A drive a whole bunch of signups, and your control have 0 signups because you didn't give the users something to sign up with, right? So that's why in that like isolated scenario, it wouldn't be.
Success metric was conversions, and not signups. Signups drove conversions versus other means drove conversions.
You could, right? So you're saying, okay, your audience, but the problem would be then your audiences are not the same, right? Like if you're, hey, here's my users from my newsletter signups, which have a very different intent, right? Have a very different kind of like usage style, they age bracket, right? Like older people like email, right? Younger people don't like email, right? Like so you're already kind of skewing it that way, where in a true A/B test environment, you want the audiences to be kind of identical in both sides, right? You can, but not ideal.